Hey YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Here's the outsiders, and there's no first dog on the moon this week.
Aprio. So there. David Astor will prepare another clue for you next week.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
If you like hearing Barry's voice so much, I decided we'd give it 2 airings this morning. Your Outsiders this week, a small and perfectly formed team of Deputy Editor of the Australian Financial Review, Aaron Patrick, and Editor of Quadrant Online, Roger Franklin. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Jonathan.
Oh, good morning, Jonathan.
Now, I trust you've both been across the Sunday papers, because we awake this morning, and Roger and I have been chatting about this already, to the news in the Fairfax Daily that departing Senator Sue Boyce has had some words to say about Tony Abbott. Sexist, she says, or does she?
Well, I think the sub-editors at the Sunday Age, and I haven't seen the Herald Sun in Sydney, Sun Herald in Sydney. I don't think too many other people have seen it, judging by its latest circulation. But the story itself commits the grave journalistic error of having a misleading headline, a plain wrong headline. Headline on the Age says, Liberal Senator Sue Boyce slams Abbott's sexism. Read the story, and what she's actually saying is, Abbott isn't a misogynist, he's just sexist. But he's really no more sexist than anybody else here, and actually, when I think about it, he's more willing to listen than anybody else.
So it does push the boat out a little far. Aaron, I mean, the interesting point too is the freedom, and we've seen a bit of this week with the departing senators, the freedom that many parliamentarians seem to find when they are finally leaving, as opposed to the discipline that controlled their language while they were there.
Well, isn't it fantastic that we have politicians who are standing up and talking about what they actually think? But look, I think Roger's being a little bit harsh on my colleague sub-editors over at the Sun Herald. Strikes me as a completely accurate headline and a pretty impressive story too, you know, like one of his own team calling the Prime Minister sexist. I think that's a pretty good story, don't you guys?
She also takes a bit of a swing at immigration policy. Quote here, I think the whole asylum seeker issue is sort of fraught with dog whistling. She says that's tough. I mean, she points out too that it's a morally fraught area. But are we surprised by this, Roger, that there's a bit of that sort of feeling within the government, even though they've gone hard on this and had success?
It appears to be a broad tent, doesn't it? That you can have people like Boyce voicing opinions on the way out the door. There's nothing unusual about that, really. The thing about it, of course, is that you really have to wonder just exactly what the Liberal Party stands for at the moment. Does it have a coherent line? Does it have a coherent policy? Can it sell what it's standing for? Does it go cap in hand to the media and expect a fair go? Because it certainly isn't going to get that.
Listeners may think that Roger is, while he's speaking, strangling a small mouse. It is in fact the pen that he keeps tweaking, which is...
Oh, my apologies. I now understand what your frantic gesticulations are about.
I thought it was my chair.
We can all relax now. Listen, it's okay, Australia. We're no longer squeaking. Aaron, I mean, Roger makes, though, I think, a pretty good point there. How many weeks are we out now from the budget, and we're still looking at a thing which is massively unresolved? There's sort of a sense of the government marking time.
There is a strong sense, I think, that the budget, even if you're a supporter of it, and the Fin Review broadly is, hasn't been sold as well as it could have been. I think, fascinating to hear Roger's view on this, sort of criticising the Liberal Party, Liberal government from the right. But you've got to say, the sales job, even if you completely believe what they're doing, hasn't cut through. It hasn't resonated. They haven't really convinced Australians in the same way that Peter Costello and John Howard did when they were bringing down their first very tough budget.
Well, what's the thing there, Roger? I mean, yes, we know that there are some issues around the Senate, but surely the tactic to overcome that potential Senate obstructionism is to build the public case, is to...
Yeah, it's the tactic and the strategy. And if they were perhaps more conversant with recent history, they might cast their eyes across the Pacific, look back a few years, and look what Ronald Reagan did. Now, Ronald Reagan was universally loathed by the press. absolutely hilarious. Sam Donaldson from ABC shouting insulting remarks at him on the White House lawn. The man, commonly written off by the left as an idiot, had the great wit to realise that you don't go to the press, expect a fair deal, cap in hand. You go around the press. Now, there have been very, very few appeals from this government at the moment directly to the people that will relate to the impact of deficit spending, what it's going to mean for kids down the road, what an ageing demographic means, various a great laundry list of issues that they could be pitching. And in this age of the internet, where you don't have to go to a dinosaur of an industry to seek some sort of coverage for what you've got, it is absolutely crazy that they're doing this. So,
I mean, can I just jump in there?
Yes, Aaron.
Because there seems to be an implicit assumption that the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, is unpopular with the press, but I've got to say he's pretty popular with about 70% of the press, isn't he?
So you're saying, Aaron, that if only journalists could vote, we'd have a bigger majority in the House than we've got
Or
at the moment.
if only everybody would do what a certain group of newspapers told them, then everything would be fine. But
No, I'm just taking issue with the Reagan analogy. As much as elegant as it is, and it does point to a more serious point, which is Tony Abbott going out there and effectively advocating his own view of the world? Now, Joe Hockey has been. Joe Hockey has got this, this, whether you agree with him or not, at least we understand where he was coming from, which is the end of age of entitlement.
and he's made that case over a long period of time and very consistently.
What's Tony Abbott's age of entitlement equivalent line?
Yeah.
Guys, can you tell me what it is? If we can't, us who consume the media day after day, can't just roll it off the top of our tongue, then does that mean he's got a problem?
Well, it means that the situation that the entire budget is set around resolving is one that's not being, properly promoted, if you like, by the government, as you say. I mean, do you sense this, Roger, that we've got a senior group in the government that is divided on the message? That yes, we know Hockey is very hardline on this and fully appreciates the structural issues that they're trying to resolve. Is Abbott more the political pragmatist? Is he being pushed to this? Does he not want to go with that much enthusiasm?
No, I'm, as a keen observer, as you know, Jonathan, and I'm at a loss to understand what the strategy is in selling this budget at the moment. If you ask my opinion of it, the budget is a compote of half measures in any case. Issues that should have been addressed weren't. And there are niggling savings, negligible savings, at great political cost. One of our Quatar correspondents, Peter Smith, noted that the savings on the pensions are going to alienate more people and they're going to cost them votes. It seems to me that this isn't a particularly astute strategy to be doing that.
And there are all sorts of contradictions, aren't there, Aaron? If we look, for example, at the one area of particular controversy around the Medicare co-payment, and yet that doesn't go to the bottom line. It's hard to understand why you would buy yourself that much trouble while not addressing your fundamental issue.
Look, at the Financial Review, we think, and going to the substance of the budget here, we think it hasn't been given a fair go, I think, by a lot of commentators, particularly on the left. And on the co-payment, we think people go to the doctor too much. Now, there are carve-outs if you've got a very serious situation or you are very poor. But this is not a nice thing to say, but some people go to the doctor for a good conversation because they're lonely. Your ex-wife. Okay.
Her great hobby was going to the doctor.
If she'd stayed with
Roger's
you,
about
she
to
would have had
launch
great
a
conversation.
mid-70s stand-up here.
No. We've still got on very well. I was talking to her only yesterday, but give her an opportunity to hop into the stirrups, and she was in there faster than Roy Rogers.
And I love my doctor, and I love talking to him, but he charges me $60 every time I go, so I don't go to him that much. So, and also on the pensions, well, look, I've got to say, I'll own up here. My father was an academic, and he's on the pension, and he's just heading off to Europe. So there is a problem with the pensions too. It's too generous, and there are people who are millionaires who are getting the pension.
The point of all of that is that there's a pretty good case to be made. And yet here we are, all these weeks down the track, the public, I think, entirely unconvinced of the worth of what's being done. I don't know how, Roger, they get around that, how they resolve that, how they sort of clear up this issue of messaging.
Yeah, perhaps by having a bit of integrity of philosophy underlying a lot of their decisions. You mentioned pensions a moment ago. My mum was going through some papers some time ago, found a group certificate from 1961. Listed on the group certificate social security payments. Now, there was a contract between the Australian people and the government of the day that if you paid in, you got the pension. That was, of course, restricted some years ago by a Labor government. But the fact was that there was a pact there. Now, the government abrogates that. If it does that and it turns around and says, you can't have the pension. That was the deal going in. That's why the taxes were paid. If I go to Coles, I buy something, I expect it to be handed over the counter. Same laws should apply to the government.
And yet, there's a sense of simplicity about that, Aaron, and yet with the government and what it's doing, there's all these other issues that run around which sort of distract the focus and unhelpfully in a lot of issues. I mean, Latin in high schools?
Latin in high schools, well, look, I think Latin's a wonderful language and we're going to benefit from learning it.
It killed Julius Caesar and it's killing me.
It's not great for speaking, unfortunately. Well, I think Chris Pine, the Federal Education Minister, has probably been given too unfairly a hard time over this because, sure, the federal government puts it on the national curriculum, but it's up to state governments and schools, and we're only talking elite private schools here, who will choose whether to make their poor students study it. So, but a great example of what you're talking about, Jonathan, was it this week when the Attorney General, George Brandis, said we will no longer refer to the West Bank as the occupied territories. And suddenly had all the Arab ambassadors into the Foreign Minister's office saying, hey, well, we're not happy about this, and they had to back down straight away. Now, that's not the kind of political own goal you want to score when you're behind in the polls and you've got a tough budget to get through the Senate.
And the Attorney General has been, own goaling at a pretty good rate through the first month of this government, and that's, then there's the focus, Roger, on things like 18C, which are important to a certain element of the sort of the ideological base of the government, but are kind of getting in the way of, the bigger push.
Well, do you think that what Brandis said about the right to be an idiot, right to be a bigot, is wrong? Because it's fundamentally correct. We have no right to do that. If that's an own goal, then it's an own goal in defence of a principle that's been there since the Enlightenment.
It's an own goal because you're being accused of watering down legislation which protects people from racial vilification. And if the senior law officer of the Commonwealth comes out and says it's okay to be bigoted...
If I hop up on the stump and I say, look, there goes a Californian, rotten, wretched, nasty, leprous creature that he is, follow me and we'll beat the daylights out of him. We don't need 18C. That's incitement to riot, and it's already illegal. Do we need any more laws? The only law we need on free speech would be a replication of the American First Amendment.
And yet, Aaron, if we're having a discussion around structural issues around the economy, about fiscal management, do we really need a big side issue, a big subplot around freedom of speech?
We don't. Freedom of speech is an incredibly important philosophical issue, but in terms of the practical problems facing Australia and the budget and the economy at the moment, it's a side issue, and it's because it incites such passions amongst the left and the right, it should be left alone while we deal with more important issues like stopping, rich people getting the pension.
Oh, Aaron, you couldn't be more wrong. There are only two principles that should guide us: property rights and free speech. And free speech is premier amongst those.
I think we've got to keep our eye on the ball, Roger, and think about this country. We are a very fortunate country, but we're also struggling in very many ways. With our educational standards are falling compared to the rest of the world. We do have more unemployment than we need. We do have a big budget problem, and we've got to deal with them first.
And do we actually have a real issue about people's freedom of speech being impinged?
Well, of course we do. We have laws that make it capable to do so.
And how often are they applied, and how often to the detriment of free speech?
Well, it was about, a year ago that the Finkelstein report came out with the provision that the calcined editors could be locked up if they refused to comply. Now, surely that's...
Was that put into law?
Is that a bit of an exaggeration?
No, have you read it? Read it at the end. It was, publish a retraction. If you refuse to do that, well, then criminal provisions may apply.
Look, when it comes to sorry, when it comes to free speech, I'm more worried about the defamation laws than anything else, to be honest, as a newspaper editor.
It's interesting that that slips through to the keeper and this entire issue, to be sure, because they are and are often used, to constrain people's expression.
Yeah, well, indeed they are. But, they've been somewhat modified. Again, I'd just point to the United States, where public figures, you can say pretty much what you like about public figures without malice. Be a very good example for us to ape here.
Gentlemen, thank you. Vexed issues, complex all, and elegantly expressed. Deputy Editor of the Australian Financial Review, Aaron Patrick, joined you this morning, along with Editor of Quadrant Online, Roger Franklin. No dog today, I'm afraid. He's off on a well-earned break, presumably romping somewhere with Gerard Henderson. He'll be back.
Okay. Well, yeah, as they said, the government of Abbottania scored yet another own goal, and it wasn't just a bunch of Arab ambassadors. Apparently in Quatar, 54 Arab ambassadors got together, heads of state or whatever it was, got together to discuss how crudely, rudely and inaccurately revisionistic it was for Senator Brandis to have decided that the part of the world which has been known as the occupied territories, which has been occupied by the Israeli army ever since the Israeli army took it in military operations in 67 and 73, that he should call it the disputed territories because the word occupied was too pejorative a term, which was a position even further out to the right of the right-wing Israeli government. But that's what Senator Brand-Arse, the dopey bastard who decided that there should be an Andrew Bolt Act in Australia to allow white neo-Nazi fascists to say whatever they like about Aborigines, because people are allowed to be idiots and bigots. A bit of a backhanded compliment by Brand-Arse to Andrew Bolt, wasn't it, Andrew Bolt should be allowed to be a bigoted idiot. But if he is a bigoted idiot, he shouldn't be given the soapbox of a national newspaper column in an organisation called News Limited, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, the exiled Australian ex-unpatriot, who was considered unpatriotic because he gave up his Australian citizenship in order to be able to take up citizenship in the excited states of Norte Armed Americano, because there were more people there was a bigger market there, he could buy more newspapers there, and he could make more money there. Strangely, Rupert's mother was a really nice old lady who gave vast amounts to charity. But apparently Rupert's father was a bit of a driven man who can't have paid enough attention to Rupert, and Rupert is still attention-seeking in his 90s. Life's like that. Or is it in his 80s? But anyway, Rupert spends $50 or $60 million a year subsidising the weekend Australian newspaper so that people like Andrew Bolt can continue to harangue the Australian public with a barrage of continuous propaganda designed to normalise the viewpoint of the extreme right wing. Now, I call them the extreme right wing because my socio-political framework was kind of drawn up during the 60s and 70s. So I see Malcolm Fraser, who these days is considered a raving, bleeding heart, left-wing socialist lunatic. When I remember Malcolm Fraser, he was the bloke who the CIA put into government in Australia after the coup in 1975, when the twice-elected Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was kicked out for being too far to the left. There was a thing called the Kemlani Loans Affair, where Edward Gough Whitlam's mates were trying to borrow some money from the Arabs, petrodollars, which were considered very rude at the time, and he wanted to set up a sort of a high-tech place, I'm going to call it a bit of a Silicon Valley, inland from the Gold Coast, so that we wouldn't have a hinterland of unemployed rednecks back from the fringe of condominiums and beach developments that's taken over the coastline. But anyway, yeah, the CIA got rid of Edward Gough Whitlam. Malcolm Fraser was put in because he was the hardline right-wing, traditional monarchist capitalist, lead us back to the 1950s type of an individual that he was considered at the time. His political views have not changed an iota. He's still the bloke who, when Vietnam, finally became one nation, and all of the people who used to work for the Americans were running away in boats, Malcolm Fraser, the liberal right-wing Prime Minister, was the one who said, yeah, well, we helped sort of get them in trouble with the communists, and therefore it's up to us to let them come here. And Australia's social fabric did not fall on its arse when the Vietnamese came and taught us how to eat a few different kinds of Asian food. And they came here and showed us how hard their kids can work in our schools, and how well they can get scholarships and go to university and make really good doctors. I remember some of the first Vietnamese doctors going through the university system. They were bloody brilliant. And they pretty much universally came from families who'd been boat people. If they were trying to get into Australia today, they would be getting locked up, detained in Manus Island or Nauru, because our right-wing lead us back to the 1950s style of government, which can't seem to put a foot right. Everything they touch is turning to shit in front of themselves. It's as if the creator of the universe is feeding Tony of the Abbottanians enough rope to tie himself a really good noose, even though he's fairly incompetent and he probably didn't do well at knots when he was in Boy Scouts either. But eventually, the events in the real world will take Tony Abbott and his ideological dogmas, and he will be hoisted on his own petard with a noose that he's tied himself. And as I understand it, a petard is a signal halyard to which a regent or a nobleman's escutcheon is hoisted below other flags on the masthead. Like, the national flag might go to the top, and somebody else's little escutcheon goes up the petard. And when somebody is hoisted on their own petard, it means that they've been allowed to tie their own noose, and they get hung on their own flagpole. I think that's where Tony Abbott is leading us. So keep a close eye on the flagpole up the top of Australia's new Parliament House. The one that's got 15 feet of dirt over the top so that it can be a better bomb shelter, because it was built during the Cold War. So sorry there's no first dog. I hope the dog is having a good holiday and not been silenced for having been too harshly objectively correct in his treatment of the Liberal government of Abbottania. Warbles on all at the YouTube. Ciao.